This is NNI Bites Big Learnings, a podcast where fellow healthcare professionals converse about the latest on nutrition science. We are joined by the chairs and speakers of NNI and WNSC Workshop 102 as they share practical insights on the impact of proper nutrition that contribute in the optimal growth of children.
Well, hello, and a very big welcome to our latest edition of NNI Bites, the podcast from the Nestlé Nutrition Institute. My name is Andrew Prentice. I'm Professor of International Nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome Professor Linda Adair to today's podcast. Linda's going to tell us about a complicated topic, regulation of healthy growth in young humans. Dr. Adair is the Carla Smith Chambly Distinguished Professor of Global Nutrition at the Gillings School of Global Public Health, and also a Fellow at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina, one of the top universities in the world. Dr. Adair is famous for her seminal work on how early nutrition has lifelong effects on growth, and in particular I've known her through her work leading an amazing longitudinal cohort based in Cebu in the Philippines. Linda, welcome. We've known each other for probably more years than we'd like to admit, so it's a special pleasure to welcome you and see you again here in Bali.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially because this topic is something very near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of work in human growth and feel that it's really very important.
It certainly is. And we're going to talk about a wonderful talk that you gave at the Nestlé Nutrition Institute's 102nd workshop. Can you believe it's 102 workshops now here in Bali? On the overall topic of the workshop was growing strong, harnessing the power of nutrition for child health. And you set the stage for later talks by summarizing the fundamentals of how growth is regulated. This podcast series is intended primarily for healthcare professionals with an interest in nutrition, so that will be our main focus. But let's begin by describing the many other factors that can influence growth apart from nutrition, starting with the fetus, if we could.
Well, yes, with the advent of ultrasound, we've really been able to learn a great deal about fetal growth from the very earliest stages of pregnancy. So starting out, fetal growth is very strongly influenced by the health and nutritional status of the mother, both before and during pregnancy. And I think that our more recent focus on preconceptional nutrition is particularly important. Maternal nutrition is manifested either as low body weight, in the case of undernutrition or micronutrient deficiencies, as well as maternal overweight and obesity, and we know that each of these can affect fetal growth. Of course, genetic factors play a role, setting growth potential within the constraints of the maternal environment. But many environmental factors are important, and these are communicated to the fetus via the very important organ, the placenta. The placenta can really be regarded as a kind of central communications hub for the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the fetus, but it's also very important for chemical messages between the mother and the child. This can be beneficial, promoting maternal adaptations that enhance the delivery of nutrients, but at the same time, many adverse maternal environmental exposures can be experienced by the fetus. And these include things like chemical exposures, such as heavy metals, a wide range of environmental chemicals that are in our food and in our water, and things like air pollution, the air we breathe, as well as exposures from maternal behavior, like smoking, alcohol, and substance use. And also maternal stress and physical activity are very important. And of course, we can't ignore the role of fathers through genetics, but also epigenetic factors that are transmitted at the time of conception.
Great, and I'm going to be so bold as to make a little call out for some of the work we've been doing in the Gambia in relation to the epigenetic factors, and that's really important, the mother's nutrition affecting how those genes are labeled in the very young fetus. And the point you made about stress is so good as well. The placenta does its best to dampen down the stress hormones coming from the mum, but it doesn't always succeed. And so then, Linda, I guess that after birth, there are similarly many factors that are affecting growth.
Yes, many of the same factors play a role, but it's important to remember that the size and the gestational age of the infant at birth which are determined prenatally, are also very strongly related to postnatal growth. So for example, many babies that are born small for gestational age or preterm continue to show growth deficits. And we've shown that in the Cebu study that I've been doing in the Philippines, where we followed kids up until 40 years of age and still see differences in their adult size as a function of their birth phenotypes. We know that early postnatal growth is very strongly about nutrition, which is why breastfeeding and appropriate complementary feeding are so important. But also recent studies have identified a key role for the microbiome, and I understand this is going to be another important topic in this series. So more details for that.
In other podcasts, as you say.
Yes.
I mean, it's truly amazing that you've set up this Cebu cohort and are still you've followed people up to 40 years of age.
Yes,
I mean,
that's right.
Kudos for that. That's a fantastic study, and I really take my hat off to you for that. Now, we now have to get into the slightly more difficult bits, and we're going to try and do this without getting overcomplicated. But you told us that growth is a highly orchestrated, I love that word orchestrated, it's all got to be organized, highly orchestrated process with a central role for what's called the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. Can you help us to start to understand that?
So this starts with the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus in the brain has been referred to as the master switchboard. And signals from the hypothalamus can stimulate the production of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. In turn, growth hormone is produced, and it stimulates yet another factor, insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1, which is produced primarily in the liver. Then IGF-1 has lots of targets throughout the body. The most important for growth is really the cells that are in the growth plates of bones and also muscle tissue. So there's a whole cascade of events that start with the hypothalamus and then end in the critical areas for growth and maturation.
And so do these processes start off in the fetus? At what stage does the IGF axis start to play a role?
Well, early in pregnancy, it's primarily maternal factors that regulate the fetal environment to affect growth and development. But as the placenta grows, it also produces growth factors that influence not only the fetus, but also the mother. So IGF-1 is produced by the placenta, and it binds to receptors in lots of different tissues around the body to stimulate growth. But by the end of the first trimester, the fetus's own endocrine system is developing, and it produces its own hormones. For example, the fetal pituitary gland produces growth hormone, the pancreas of the fetus produces insulin, and thyroid produces thyroid hormones. And all of these are very important in the regulation of growth and maturation of the fetal organs. So it's both maternal influences and fetal influences that are operating in utero.
Great. And I always learned, correct me if this is right or wrong, that one of the reasons that mothers with diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes in pregnancy, have these very big babies, overgrown babies, is because the baby senses the extra glucose coming across the placenta. It drives up their insulin, and that drives up growth. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, insulin is a really important growth factor and responsible for the excess growth that we see in babies born to mothers with gestational diabetes.
Great. So then the baby is born, having already gone through the vast majority of its differentiating cell divisions. In other words, it's a baby human.
Right.
And from then on, it's mostly a case of growing bigger. I loved your description of a conceptual model set up many years ago by a gentleman called Johan Karlberg, who did most of his work in Hong Kong, in his so-called ICP model of human growth. Can you summarize this for us?
Yes, Karlberg identified 3 stages of growth, and the ICP stands for infancy, childhood, and puberty. And each of these phases is characterized by different rates of growth or growth velocities. So immediately after birth, continuing the rapid growth that occurred in utero, growth velocity is very high in infants, but it slows down, and it decelerates pretty rapidly in the first 9 to 12 months, and then reaches a relatively steady state after the baby's about a year old. And about 15% of adult height is attained during that period of infancy. During this stage, growth is strongly regulated by nutrition, And then growth hormone becomes necessary to sustain the child's growth after about 2 to 3 months. And with the stimulation of IGF-1, those levels increase gradually from birth to guide the process of growth that's occurring during infancy. Then the childhood phase comes, and about 40% of adult stature is achieved during childhood. It's characterized by a relatively steady growth rate of about 6 to 8 centimeters per year. And here, that growth hormone IGF axis that we talked about plays a really critical role. Growth hormone is released in a pulsatile manner, and then during childhood, the frequency and amplitude of those pulses actually increases to promote growth. And there are a couple of other hormones that become really important in this time period. For example, the thyroid produces hormones that both modulate the effects of growth hormone, but also can have a direct effect on the cells, for example, in the growth plates where bone growth occurs. Okay, then we get to the pubertal growth stage, where there's a very rapid acceleration of growth, and the final 15% of adult height is attained. And during the pubertal phase, growth rates can reach up to about 12 centimeters per year. And I recall my mother reporting that my brother grew 15 centimeters over one summer to reach his very tall adult height. I became aware of that growth spurt early on as he had that amazing increase in height. During this phase, growth is strongly regulated by, again, hypothalamic influences that I mentioned earlier, but the target now is the gonadal axis, where sex hormones are stimulated. And these are very powerful promoters of growth in terms of both bone growth, muscles, and the development of fat tissue. And nutrient needs are especially high to support this important period of growth.
Yeah, and as you say, nutrition is key at all these phases. Whatever are the mechanisms and the hormones regulating it, they're all responsive to nutrition. Now, let's spend a few moments talking about a theory that is a little bit controversial in some areas, called saltation and stasis. And you told me earlier that this theory was first suggested by a great friend of yours.
Yes.
Tell me about this.
Right. So my best friend in graduate school and colleague, Dr. Michelle Lampol, is really famous for this particular theory. So if you look at growth charts, you might think that growth is a very smooth process. And this is what's depicted in the growth charts that we use regularly to assess a child's size relative to a reference population. But Michelle did very careful and precise work measuring infants on a daily basis. She trained her research assistants very highly. They did interreliability assessments to make sure that they were both measuring a child in exactly the same way to rule out measurement error. And what she found is that there are periods that are marked by little or no linear growth. So this is the stasis phase. And then the babies grow up to perhaps nearly a centimeter per day. So this is really quite remarkable, but you would not see this unless you had very careful daily measurements. And we typically don't do that. There's individual variation in the frequency and amplitude of those saltations, and they're more frequent during periods of rapid growth. And the other thing is that Dr. Lampol, in her interviews with moms, discovered that those periods of more rapid infant growth are associated with changes in infant sleep patterns, also their appetites, and also minor episodes of illness. So there's something going on physiologically, and we might think of this of the quiescent periods as times to build up energy that are then required for that growth spurt to occur. So as you mentioned, this is somewhat controversial. There are other studies that haven't found this, but I think that her evidence is really quite convincing and could not have happened without that very careful daily measurement. Of course, we can't do this on every child, but this is, I think, very important for us to understand the mechanisms through which growth can occur.
And I can reassure you, actually, we've got some data which is not yet fully published from the Gambia, where we've done such measurements following Michelle's theory. And it really does support her theory about saltations and stasis. I always think about this like building a house, and I've built a couple of houses. You have to get all your materials together. You make your blocks out of your cement and your sand and your gravel and things, and then suddenly the wall, as you put those blocks in place, the wall makes a huge leap forward. Let's detour shortly into the issue of infection and growth faltering that's so common in low-income countries.
Well, for quite a while, we've really appreciated that there is an important synergism of nutrition and infection. And this idea of synergism was really promoted by the excellent work of Dr. Nevin Scrimshaw. The idea here is that undernourished children are more susceptible to infection because of impairments in their immune system. And then when they're ill, they may experience nutrient losses and elevated nutrient needs. And with illnesses such as diarrhea, there can be damage to the cells lining the intestines, and this impairs their ability to absorb nutrients. So even when the illness is resolved, or with continuing kind of low-level asymptomatic infections, the gut is damaged to the point where it can't effectively absorb the nutrients even when they're provided. So compensatory growth or catch-up growth is possible after infections. And for young infants, it's particularly important for moms to breastfeed during episodes of infection and to continue to do that after the infection appears to have resolved.
Nevin Scrimshaw was a giant in our field, and his work in Guatemala resonated with work done by my mentor, Roger Whitehead, in the Gambia, which showed exactly what you just described, that transient short-term infections, particularly diarrhea, damage the gut and then make it very difficult for the child to absorb the nutrients. So you ended your talk, Linda, on this phrase, this new concept really of nurturing care. What do we mean by nurturing care, and how can we improve this?
So nurturing care is really a framework. It's been supported by a very strong evidence base, and there was an excellent Lancet series of papers that provide that evidence base. Nurturing care encompasses nutrition, healthcare, responsive caregiving, safety and security, and opportunities for the child to learn. And these have all been put together and have actually become part of the Sustainable Development Goals. We know from studies of institutionalized children or children that have suffered abuse that even if they get adequate nutrition to support their physical needs, they may not grow well. And this has been termed psychosocial short stature. And this occurs because of a lack of stimulation and nurturing interactions between the child and their caregiver. And there may be stress pathways that operate through some of those hormonal control mechanisms that I talked about earlier. So it's very important to couple nutrition interventions with responsive care interventions, to teach moms that feeding should be a back and forth, that they should respond to the hunger and satiety cues from their infants and feed them accordingly. So in terms of interventions, the idea is that they should build in not only the nutrients, but also this aspect of care. And the goal here is for children not only to grow, but also to thrive. And that's, I think, a really important word. We want our children to be healthy, but we also want them to be happy and successful and thriving. And this is why it's so important that this nurturing care framework has become part of our strategy, I think, for improving child health.
You're so right. And it's so difficult, though, for many mums who are busy and maybe don't have the knowledge to put all this together. So I hope our healthcare professionals listening will be able to help their mums that they see day to day to learn some of these skills. Linda, a huge thank to you for guiding us through this really complex topic so very clearly. I loved your talk, and I really urge listeners to access it from the NNI 365 platform, because actually the diagrams you had in your talk are so helpful in terms of getting these complex things across. So do have a look at Linda's talk. A huge pleasure having you. Let me end by summarizing your key messages. If I quote your own words, healthy growth reflects the harmonization of multiple interacting genetic, hormonal, nutritional, epigenetic, and psychosocial factors from conception right through to adulthood. And these effects are orchestrated by a complex system of hormones that help to regulate growth at different periods of development. And they take different positions and they take turns, if you like, in being the dominant ones that at different phases. But all of these are sensitive to nutrition and the wider aspects of nurturing care that you've just described. And listeners can hear more about the specifics in the accompanying podcasts. Thank you for listening to this episode of NNI Bites Big Learnings. Please subscribe through the NNI 365 app to ensure that you don't miss some of the very many future and indeed past offerings.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to participate in this.
Thank you, Linda.
And that concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining us for this special episode from NNI and WNSC Workshop 102. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this quick discussion, fellow experts. Till the next episode.